Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 239. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I'm breaking down what's happening in Ukraine and, of course, how the war is impacting the U.S.-Russia relationship. So, tons of important stuff on today's show. Share it. It's at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com. Video version, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. Facebook account, Twitter is at @con_interest. My Twitter handle is at @KyleAnzalone_. Be sure you're reading the news roundup section at the Libertarian Institute every day. Me and Will Porter are doing quite a bit of writing for the Institute there, including covering what's happening in Ukraine for the Institute. And then you can donate to the show, Patreon, Subscribe Star, or crypto. All that information in the show notes page, as well as the information for our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. That saves you 20% off when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. Paloma Verde has high-quality CBD products with the lab test results on their website. If you're new to CBD, they offer education on how CBD could help you and which of their products could potentially best work for you. They have just about anything you can imagine with CBD. New products coming out all the time. My personal favorite, though, are the topicals. Works absolutely great for muscle pain relief. Little bit of that will last for several hours. Smells great. No temperature changes or anything like that. Just nice lotion that works well. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. Okay, let's get into the show. I want to start off today by just kind of going through the write-ups that me and Will have been doing at the Institute, starting from last Wednesday when the fighting erupts, and then Thursday and Friday as well. So Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a special military operation in Ukraine with reports of blasts erupting in several cities across the country. And so the initial attack, we get this announcement from Putin that it's a special military operation, which is seems synonymous with invasion at this point. At least 30,000 Russian troops have entered Ukraine, with I think as many as 50,000 reported. There are reports now of about 200 airstrikes total. Initially, I think that first day they put the number around 40, but all of these numbers I think are still open to a lot of question, and potentially not true, potentially true. But there definitely have been some air missile strikes. That occasionally we'll say that was a cruise missile, that was an airstrike, that was a ballistic missile. I wouldn't count it. It was something that Russia fired that fell from the sky. Also, some of the longer range artillery could probably be mistaken for some kind of missile attack. But overall, Russian attacks have done a good amount of damage in Ukraine. But I'll explain more about that later. Back to the article. This is Vladimir Putin. Circumstances require us to take decisive and immediate action. And the People's Republic of Donbass turned to the Russia with a request for help in this regard, in accordance with Article 51, Part 7 of the UN Charter, with the sanctions of the Russian Federation Council, and in pursuant of the friendship treaties ratified by the Federal Assembly and mutual assistance with the DPR and LPR. I have decided to conduct special military operations. And so, that is the announcement. It came along with, I think, about an hour-long speech, and me and Connor had, I believe, talked about this a little bit. Anyways, various media outlets have reported explosions in major Ukrainian cities, as well as early phases of Russian land operations. The full extent of the actions remain unclear. There have also been numerous reports of fighting along the lines of contact in the Donbass between separatist forces and Ukrainian regulars. And that does seem to be ongoing all the way now through Sunday, that fighting in the Donbass region. From the different maps, people who are alleging to, track it. In some places do, I think, have a pretty good reputation, like Live UA Maps. That is a site that typically does a pretty good job with, mapping what side controls where. Hasn't shown much progress on either side in the Donbass, although some of the videos that have come out are alleged to show some pretty heavy fighting in the Donbass. So I'm not sure exactly what that means, but those are the reports from that region. Ukrainians military has described this as a full-scale invasion, and in some respect, you could find some truth to that, because they are, launching airstrikes, and they have moved tanks, artillery, and soldiers, special operations forces into Ukraine. However, the U.S. was talking about the, full option being the maximum option for Putin, being an invasion of 175,000 troops, and certainly were far less than that. Again, I think the number that most people are citing is about 30 to 50,000, which is, a pretty small percentage portion of the forces that Russia had built up. And when you consider that Ukraine's army is, anywhere between 100, 150,000, and then with different militia and citizens, they armed far higher than that. The Russian troop number is not that large. Now, another thing I want to talk about with the size of the militaries, and the amount of territory that's exchanged hands, I guess I'm kind of surprised at, the most of the death counts coming in at the hundreds at this point, maybe into the thousands, when you're talking about what the Ukrainian government is claiming the damage they inflicted upon the Russians. But generally speaking, I'm seeing the civilian casualties in the low hundreds, 100, 200 or something like that. That includes deaths and injuries, of course, and the deaths number, I've had trouble tracking anything down. Somebody reported scores. At one point, the UN had said that Russian airstrikes had caused death and injuries among civilians. From the footage that you've seen, that definitely seems like it can be the case, but it's not 100% clear what's happening with all this. Now, one more thing I want to mention that happened Wednesday was Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland invoked Article 4 of the UN bloc, which says that there's a potential threat to the territorial integrity and security of a member state, and so that requires to hold a major meeting for NATO. Now, Joe Biden announced in his speech, which I believe was on Thursday, that he ends up speaking. He says that, that they're going to do a big meeting. It's unclear if that's the Article 4 meeting or not. My guess is that it will be. And I do know that some of the steps that NATO has taken have been to deploy its rapid response force, which is 40,000 soldiers. Now, it's not exactly clear how many of those 40,000 are being deployed, where they're being deployed to, and what all that comprises of, but NATO does say they're deploying some forces. Biden on Thursday also announced more American troops will be headed to Germany, and I think some troops that are stationed in Germany already, but in different, some helicopters from Greece ended up in the Baltics, and things like that are happening. No significant number of forces seem to be being moved by the U.S. or its European allies to actually significantly change anything on the ground in terms of if Russia could invade or not, right? If you put 2,000 troops in Latvia, it's not going to stop the Russians from invading Latvia, right? And so that I think is a very important thing to note, is that it seems that most of these troop movements are token, and I believe even John Kirby said that it's a show of support for our allies in the Baltic states and Poland and Eastern Europe and things like that. But it's not as John Kirby, by the way, is the Pentagon spokesperson, but it's not as much of a move to necessarily think that they're going to like be able to do anything in Ukraine or counter in any way. And so that brings me to one point I did want to mention on today's show, and that is like the response from the libertarians, which overall, instinctually almost everybody has been, we don't want to send troops to Ukraine, which is great, but only 26% of Americans do. And even more importantly, among the 74% of Americans who don't want to send troops to Ukraine is American President Joe Biden, who has been fairly committed this entire time to saying that hell no, America will not be sending troops to Ukraine. He doesn't seem to have wavered on this at all. And in fact, once the administration became confirmed that there was going to be an invasion of Ukraine, it removed the Florida National Guard soldiers that were in Ukraine. And so that's good that, we don't have to argue with that because Biden is good on that. Now, that doesn't mean the rest of the U.S. Foreign policy establishment, the blob, the deep state a lot of them would like to send troops into Europe or into Ukraine to fight Russia, but Biden doesn't want to. And so one of the things that, that says, I guess, is that on libertarians' perspective, we don't need to be arguing that. What we need to be arguing are the aggressive things that America is still doing. There's a lot of people talking about a no-fly zone. Apparently, there's even conversations about this in the White House. That would mean that we're going to say that we're going to shoot down Russian planes that operate over Ukrainian airspace. No-fly zone is one of these words that really is almost a euphemism at this point for meaning that America is going to take over control of this country's airspace. It's not a no-fly zone entirely, it's a no-Russian fly zone, right? And so that's very serious. That's very provocative. NATO has talked about moving air defense systems into, I guess, position to do this, which would almost certainly make those air defense systems targets for Russia. And I mean, who absolutely knows where we go from there? But there's some pretty crazy things being discussed. And so that's where us libertarians need to really, I think, be directing our focus. And then, two, on the sanctions issue, which is going to be a little bit of a harder fight right now because everybody loves sanctions, and anytime somebody does something bad, everybody wants to sanction them. But at the same time, that these sanctions are long-term destructive, not only for Russia but for the world economy at large, and also it's collective punishment. You're just targeting the Russian people who are protesting this intervention in Ukraine far more than the American people have protested a war in the past 18 years. And so maybe Syria would be one example where there's maybe close to the level of protests in 2013, but I mean, Yemen, nothing. Most of that Afghanistan this entire time, nothing. Iraq War 3, Syria, at the beginning, but then the entire time that the U.S. has been waging war there for 8 years now, nothing. Libya, nothing. Somalia, nothing. And so, to say that the Russian people are somehow bad because their government is waging a war, which is wrong, in Ukraine, right? Like, the U.S. citizens shouldn't be sanctioned by the rest of the world because George Bush waged a war in Iraq, right? Like, I don't think either of those things. So, that's another reason to be opposed to sanctions. Also, it's economic warfare. If you heard Biden announce the sanctions in the tone that he was using, this is meant to hurt the Russian people. That's what he wants. He knows that Putin is insulated, that Putin will be fine from whatever the sanctions do. He wants the common Russian people to suffer from what the government is doing because he's an angry old man. And, and these things are problematic long term. Even take Korea for an example, where the South Koreans want to talk with the North Koreans, and the U.S. sanctions are a barrier to that. Because of the sanctions are in place, the South Koreans can't do these kind of, not like concessions to the North Koreans, simply to get in the way of like traveling and talks and things like that. The sanctions prevent barriers and just obstacles to that happening. And so, yeah, you gotta oppose the sanctions as well, but particularly the weapons. Now, another reason to oppose the weapons, and this was something that was apparently being discussed in the White House report at Foreign Policy, Biden administration debates legality of arming Ukrainian resistance. Now, I guess one way to that maybe the White House is going to try to split this is to say we're going to arm the Ukrainian government as long as the Ukrainian government exists, but if maybe the Ukrainian government stops existing, then we're not going to arm the resistance, the insurgency, the Ukrainian insurgency to the Russian occupation, should that be the overall outcome of the war, which I'm not exactly sure is the case. However, I think that's like too narrow to look at this. And what is actually happening is if the U.S. is giving Ukraine weapons that they are taking, from, like, let's say the border with Poland, and then they're driving them, across to Kiev and shooting them at Russian tanks, that does make America a combatant in this war. Not to the same level that Russia is, but it does make an America and a combatant in this war. And, these kind of things do cause the wars to drag on, and, will likely cause real problems from Russia. We're seeing tons of people have made this point. One of the things that I have been warning about on the show, one of the reasons that I thought that invasion of Ukraine by Russia wasn't completely off the table, is you have a bunch of lunatics in the Biden administration that think like Representative Ro Khanna, who is telling foreign policy here that this is going to be in Afghanistan for Russia. And so when they're pouring in weapons, that's what they're talking about. They want to be able to kill Russians for decades in Ukraine. That's, I think, part of the Hot's plan here, to like hurt the Russians, and that's what they want to do. Now, I don't have confirmation on that. That is speculation on my part. I'm trying to be very upfront about, but statements from the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, in the same sentence as acknowledging that this will be absolutely terrible and brutal for the Ukrainians, does say that, like, hey, this will be bad for Russia. The fact that you got Victoria Nuland, who's a avid Russia hawk in the administration, and again, statements from people like Ro Khanna, who is a notable Democrat on foreign policy. I think that he's expressing this view to foreign policy, I think, is very concerning, that this may actually be the goal of the administration, is to fight Russia and Ukraine. And how messed up is this to do to the people of Ukraine? The whole thing, really, right? From 2008, what George Bush did on pledging eventual NATO membership for Ukraine, right? Which put Ukraine in the Russian crosshairs. As soon as that happened, Russia gets a lot more concerned about Ukraine, right? Because if Ukraine becomes a NATO member state, they start to get more weapons. They start to get missile defense. They start to get Patriot missile batteries. Then, they could load up Tomahawks in those Patriot missile batteries, and suddenly Ukraine has become a potential hosting ground for nuclear weapons that could strike Russia. I mean, that's what Russia saw back in 2007, and with the progression that's happened since, the U.S. has moved like 80% of the way there. They haven't made NATO or Ukraine an official NATO member, but they're kind of a de facto NATO member state. They haven't put the Patriot missile batteries there, but anytime the Ukrainians ask, the U.S. moves more warships into the Black Sea that are loaded up with the same missile launchers that the Patriot missile batteries are, and these things are, again, all issues for Russia. So, just to wrap up the conversation on the weapons transfers, there's a lot of important things happening with Germany deciding that they are going to give Ukraine weapons. I think they're looking at 1,000 anti-tank, anti-armor weapons and 500 Stingers. Importantly, they're going to allow one of the Baltic states to travel to give German artillery systems that I think at one point were given to Norway, and so Germany still had to approve those. And they're going to allow different countries to fly weapons through German airspace to Ukraine, and that wasn't happening before. These are all major steps for Germany that haven't been taken since the Second World War, where they've tried to adopt specific policies, not to sell weapons to combat zones and things like that. The U.S. is also going to give Ukraine more military aid. Biden announced $350 million in additional military aid. The Pentagon's press spokesperson John Kirby talked about this during a press conference, saying that the logistics have changed to make it more difficult, but they were planning to go ahead and continue with the aid. So he was saying that, look, Ukraine doesn't control Ukrainian airspace now. Not that he was necessarily saying it's controlled by Russia, but that we're not going to fly a bunch of Javelin missiles into Kiev anymore. It can't happen. And so it's not exactly clear what the U.S. is going to do to get these weapons to Ukraine. My guess is that they go to Poland and then cross the border, or Romania or another state. But again, you could have a pretty serious reaction from Russia on this. Now, not exactly clear how much weapons will end up going to Ukraine as part of this, but the White House has now asked Congress for $6.4 billion for general aid in the Ukraine crisis. $2.9 million will go towards military and humanitarian aid, and $3.5 billion will go to the Pentagon. Again, it's exactly unclear to me where the stats of the money are going, how much is going to go in aid, and what kind of weapon systems we're talking about here, and how might Russia respond to these announcements. But I suspect it could be quite serious and potentially a really, really major issue for the entire planet that we're talking about here. All right, so on to Thursday now in Ukraine. We had Russia seizing the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown site, and that seems to have gone okay. And then Putin also offered surrender terms to Zelensky. It's initially what happened when Russia offered the talks is, I believe they said that the talks would be in Belarus, and so the Ukrainians said, no, let's do the talks in Warsaw, and the Russians said that the Ukrainians went out of contact. I'm guessing they responded that no, the talks will be in Belarus. And then somebody in a high-ranking Ukrainian government official floated the idea of Israel hosting talks. Israel gave a pretty non-committal answer to that, which it sounded like we probably got to consult the Americans and the Russians before we agree to that. But Israel has said that it is in a unique position to carry out negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, as both countries have a large Jewish population, and there's some truth to that. And maybe that is the case. Maybe China is another country that could potentially negotiate an end to this. However, we did hear this this morning in the United States. I guess it'd probably be the afternoon, Sunday afternoon in Ukraine and Russia, that Zelensky and a Russian representative would meet on the border of Belarus and Ukraine for talks. The Russian demands are apparently somewhat reasonable, but maybe not. So the first demand is that Ukraine remains neutral, which I think is entirely reasonable. And Zelensky would be a fool not to, agree to that. Number two is that where it could be complicated, which is Ukraine needs to demilitarize and denazify. And so in the first part, what does demilitarization mean? Does it mean Ukraine will not host any NATO weapons, and that would include like Stingers and Javelins and things like that? While that would be a pretty limiting restriction to put on Ukraine, that isn't absolutely absurd. Maybe there would have to be limits on like Ukraine's missiles, a statement from Ukraine on ensuring that it never sought nuclear weapons. Things along those lines all seem reasonable, things that could get done and worked out. Now, if Russia is saying that like Ukraine can't have any kind of military at all, that's probably not going to happen. And if that's the case, that this war is just going to drag on. And then the denazify, again, if, Putin is really just talking about like the Azov battalion gets demilitarized and some of those guys go to jail, the right sector gets demilitarized, that could probably happen and get done, and hell, would probably be a good thing. But it could also mean, in a larger sense, like eliminating any anti-Russian ideology from Ukraine, right? Like the US will say we got to go to Iraq or Yemen to kill the terrorists, and okay, yeah, like, terrorists, people who go into markets and blow themselves up are bad people, and so it would make sense that you don't want those people there. However, we know that that means a lot more than just killing terrorists, and so that's why, you're opposed to those kind of campaigns. And so I don't want to say I'm opposed to an anti-Nazi campaign. However, my guess is that while there is a legitimate neo-Nazi presence in Ukraine, that Putin's demand could go far, greater on the political spectrum than people who are just ideological Nazis. And so, it sounds like a good talking point, but at the same time, it sounds like there could be like something really ugly and nefarious behind it. On the same side of that, something I want to talk about, and we saw a lot of this on Thursday in Ukraine as well. They were just handing out guns to everyone in Kiev. Anybody who wanted a gun could go get one from the Ukrainian government, and they said that they could go use those guns to shoot the Russians, which, whenever your country is under attack, invasion, I do understand that, like, at some point, maybe there is that level of desperation. At the same time, giving somebody an AK-47 isn't the same thing as giving somebody a sword or something like that. You know what I mean? And you could potentially cause some real problems within your own civilian population. People get paranoid and start opening fire on anybody coming to their door, things like that. There's been a couple reports of that happening, that a couple innocent people were killed at a checkpoint because, some jumpy civilian with a gun shot at them. I don't know if it's true or not, but certainly the kind of thing that could absolutely happen and does happen in war zones. And so, these people are completely it's not like before, where they're doing a little bit of training with people, at least I'm sure, showing them how to signal, like when a friendly is around and things like that. That way they're not opening fire on their own, their neighbors or something like that, who are just across the street and not the Russian invaders at all. But the other issue I see here is combined with another part of the rhetoric that's been coming out from the Ukrainian government, and that is, and I'm not sure if this is true or not, my guess is that there's some truth to it, but that they're exaggerating, and that is the idea that there's Russian saboteurs in Kiev who have embedded themselves within the Ukrainian military or the Ukrainian population that are helping Russia to overthrow their government. There's reports from the Ukrainian government that scores of people have been killed or captured here. And in a way, they could just be talking about like legitimate, like Russian actors who like are working for the Kremlin, who are trying to undermine the security of Kiev and the Ukrainian government and things like that. At the same time, this could just be rhetoric and cover for essentially an anti-Russian pogrom, and anybody who is fortunate enough to live in Kiev and have a more nuanced take about what's happening and not ready to go rah, yellow and blue and all that, could find themselves, in a bad situation. And that's certainly something I think we have to consider is probably happening in Ukraine. So, let's see. I'm not sure if I have anything else from Thursday. Let's go to Friday now, where me and Will write at the Libertarian Institute here. Kiev expected to fall within days as pressure mounts for Biden to act. This on Friday. In Ukraine, we had Russian troops approaching Kiev from 3 different fronts, mostly, I think, from the north, both east and west. So Kiev, I believe, sits like kind of on the Dnieper River. It's spelled with a D, but I don't think you pronounce the D in Dnieper. And there are Russian forces that have come from north from Belarus on both sides of the river and have now reached the very least the outskirts of Kiev, if not are well within the city, and maybe within like city skyscraper proper. Last night, Saturday night, Sunday morning, in Kiev, there was some pretty intense fighting reported, including a Ukrainian military base outside the city that had some kind of fuel or oil reserves. Exactly what it was is unclear to me. That exploded last night. Ukraine says it was a Russian airstrike, and while that's certainly, I think, probably the most likely cause of it, not the only one, it is a fuel, some kind of depot in a war zone, and so it wouldn't surprise me if it got set on fire by ADSNIT, artillery fire or something from either side. I guess there's also a possibility that the Ukrainian government would have set it off for a number of reasons. If Russia is looking to use that military base, that would certainly make it unusable if you're having to retreat and can no longer hold it. Also, if you're out of like anti-aircraft and you were to set that on fire, anybody who saw the skies of Kiev last night, I mean, almost looked like Mordor from Return of the Kings looking from Minas Tirith, right? Where, you see like this great looming red sky. There's a little like radio tower off to the right. It's kind of crazy. But at the same time, my guess is that kind of massive fire smoke would have definitely prevented any Russian attack helicopters from approaching anywhere where there was that cover for smoke. And so if they needed to cover for a retreat or just in general to stave off some Russian attacks, I mean, I'm not comparing the Ukrainian government to ISIS, but this is an effective attack that was used by ISIS in Iraq to prevent different kinds of airstrikes and things like this. The smoke burns so black, so thick that it really helps to give cover from airstrikes if you don't have an air force, which it seems unlikely that Ukraine has much of one left at this time. To the fact that they might not even have an air force left now. They do seem to have some anti-aircraft still, but who knows how much longer that's going to run, where they're getting it from, and if Russia will be able to destroy that in the next couple of days. Ukraine also announced that they were having a general mobilization, conscripting all their men, barring the men from leaving the country. So at the one time you have all this media coverage of look how brave all the Ukrainians are, how willing they are to fight, but at the same time they are being conscripted, and that's not unimportant to remember. And of course it's a tragedy of Putin's war here, but an action on the Ukrainian government as well. I think that's most of the important stuff that I had from Thursday. Now let's move on to Friday. Oh no, that was the Friday one. Oh, the last part of the Friday stuff was just the mounting pressure on Biden to do more, including the no-fly zone, with representatives like Adam Kissinger pushing that. So Saturday in Ukraine, me and Will didn't do a write-up. Took the day off from writing on Saturday, but I was following what happened and seeing the Russian forces push a little bit further into Kiev. There's been talks over the past, I would say, 48 hours that Russia is about to launch a massive air offensive in Ukraine, but that hasn't happened yet. Yeah, so I guess a couple of more general things about the fighting in Ukraine. Russia has deployed, I think, 30 to 50,000 of their forces. They've carried out a good number of airstrikes. I've read reports up to 200. Maybe it's more at this point. Maybe there's some misreporting on what's an airstrike and what's artillery fire and things like that. But there's been a significant amount of damage done, and at least some of it done by the Russian side. For sure, I'm just saying of what I could absolutely say. Same thing for the Ukrainian side, right? But, they are defending their country from the Russians. And so the fact that they're doing damage, defending their country is less, somewhat concerning than the, Russians doing it while they're invading, right? As well as attacking Kiev from the north. They have also been deploying soldiers along other areas of the border with Belarus, securing other larger Ukrainian cities, and then also in the south. They've made quite a bit of progress up the Black Sea coast. So if you Crimean Peninsula, you're looking on a map, and then you go up the coast to the west, they made quite a bit of progress, and I guess they're looking to link up with the Donbass and hold an entire corridor along the Black Sea and cut the Ukrainian government off there. They're also moving north from the Crimean Peninsula up the Dnieper River. I guess it's kind of unclear if maybe the plan is, to go and be a part of the siege offensive of Kiev. Maybe it's just to secure the entire river as a way to divide Ukraine in half and cut the eastern half of the country off from its forces in the west. It doesn't seem like there has been a whole lot of progress made in the Donbass fighting out towards the Ukrainian government going east or going west that way, excuse me. So anyways, a lot going on there, and things are changing pretty rapidly. Talks this morning, who knows how that's going to change things up. But yeah, I think that kind of covers what's going on in the larger sense on the ground in Ukraine. I do want to get into a couple of specific topics, things that I'm pretty sure at this point are false narratives. The Ghost of Kiev, this was alleged to be an old retired fighter pilot that came out of retirement, and as described by so many people in the American press, was single-handedly preventing Russia from controlling the skies of Kiev. Doesn't seem like that's the case. There's some evidence that a couple Russian jets have been shot down, but I wouldn't even go as far as to confirm that's the case. There were, I think, emissions from Russia that maybe 2 jets had gone down due to mechanical issues. And so, it's possible that it happened. It's possible 2 guys shot down and Russia just claims they're mechanical issues. But, that's what's being discussed. They've claimed to have taken out quite a few Russian helicopters. I have no idea if that's the case at all. And they did claim, and it does seem to be the case, that while their Air Force was intact, they had a couple successful air raids against Russian armored columns with them, but only in maybe 1 or 2 cases. But going back to the Ghost of Kiev, it now seems that didn't exist, that there wasn't, since people that were shot down, as well as with the Snake Island claim. It was alleged that Russia pulled up a ship off the coast of this island in the Black Sea, Snake Island, and I believe it's in the Black Sea, and said hey, surrender. And the 13 brave Ukrainian soldiers on the island told the Russians to F off. And then Russian opened fire and killed them all as they bravely defended the Ukrainian outpost. Turns out that there were a lot more people there, and 80 people surrendered. It's not exactly clear to me if anybody died actually defending that island. It appears that the transcript may be correct, and that there was somebody on the island that told the Russians that, but again, the whole narrative isn't true. Now, it's one thing for the Ukrainian government to put this out. If you are, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, and you are choosing to fight this war, your role as commander-in-chief, I guess, is to make sure your military fights. And part of that is to make them feel like it's kind of going well. And so coming up with things like, the Snake Island heroes and the Ghost of Kiev, keeps people excited, less nervous, gives them, things to talk about, things to fight for, and ideas that you could be the next, person that rallies your country's resistance and saves, the people of Kiev or from whatever city from the Russian invasion. So I get it. At the same time, I think it's completely irresponsible for the U.S. media to be repeating this kind of stuff, which happened a lot. They were using all this, and the reason that they were saying this wasn't because, they want the Ukrainians to feel better. They're saying it in English. They're saying it because they want the Americans to think that we could arm the Ukrainians to resist Russia. This is about fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. It's against, I think, in the long run, Ukrainian interests to do this. The army Ukraine is what got us here in the first place with the Russian invasion. And so the U.S. needs to be going in the opposite direction, less support for Ukraine, make them less of a threat to Russia, right? a couple more stories that are questionable on narrative. The tank running over the car. People, instantly claiming that Russia was running down and murdering Ukrainian civilians with their tanks. Now, the first thing, and this is an absolute miracle, apparently the guy's alive. There's a video where you could see the car, and the guy is sitting in there. It's now convertible. He's trapped in it. In a sense, I don't think this should take away from what we think about, because in the 999 other times this happens, that guy is crushed in a very disgusting way. And the fact that he's alive is an absolute miracle. Now, the reason I brought that up was because it might not have been a Russian war crime. The allegation, I believe, from the Ukrainian side is that a Russian defector, disruptor, saboteur hopped in this tank, got control of this tank, and ran down a Ukrainian citizen in a rampage for fun. I don't know. The problem is that there weren't Russian forces in Kiev at that time, so that's one issue. War correspondent Elijah Magnier wrote about this on Twitter, so you check out his account and read about it if you want to get into his details on that. But more importantly, if you look at a little bit of a longer and wider view clip of what happened there, there's fighting going on, and both the car and the tank, the car fleeing, the tank going towards the fighting, I don't think that either were not, maybe the car was trying to avoid the tank and swerve, the tank was trying to avoid the car and swerve, something like that. But a lot of tank operators have pointed out that there's almost no way that you could have tried to run over that car, that this guy lost control of that tank, maybe to avoid the car that was, I think, heading towards him, and ends up running over potentially a Ukrainian soldier running over a Ukrainian car there. And again, unfortunately, nobody ends up dead. Now, I suppose the defector narrative is somewhat possible, that, some Russian hopped in a tank and started driving it down the street. Seems kind of unlikely to me. And then also just the maneuvering of the tank, it seems far more likely that it was an accident that, luckily nobody died in that tank was probably operated by the Ukrainian military. There's a missile that hit an apartment building and injured, I think, 3 people, maybe killed 1. And there's a video of it. Definitely had some projectile, definitely hit that building. Questions about whose projectile it was. Of course, the Ukrainians say Russia. Aramate has a nice thread on Twitter going through it, explaining that it could very well be a Ukrainian missile or rocket, potentially an anti-aircraft, or a missile defense rocket like an S-300 type rocket, and that's what could have hit that apartment building. Now, there's 2 things here. One, is Putin still responsible? It's his war. There's no, there's no doubt that Ukraine would have fired that aircraft missile if it wasn't for the war that Russia is waging, right? Okay. At the same time, when you are discussing it, though, there is a difference from somebody intentionally targeting, blowing up apartment buildings like Israel does in Palestine and Gaza, versus an errant air defense missile hitting the side of an apartment building. You know what I mean? When you're talking about it, when you're discussing the consequences for it and everything, the 2 are different. And then similarly, there was a shoot down of a jet. Don't know who shot it down. Don't know whose jet it was. Over Kiev. It ends up, as it crashes, hitting an apartment building. And again, Putin responsible for this overall, right? His war and everything like that. But it's not the same thing as saying that Russia targeted an apartment building and killed someone, which is what I'm seeing come out from several different outlets. So those things I just, want to try to put a little more context and perspective and everything like that, because you're getting a very one-sided view from the mainstream media. It's all rah, Ukraine, Russia bad, Putin, Hitler. No nuance to any of this conversation at all. They're saying that, on all the channels, the Ukrainian resistance is doing great and everything like that. I don't know if that's untrue, but it definitely doesn't seem that there's anything to suggest that it is. And then I saw reported on the TV that they were doing a naval invasion of Odessa, and it just seems that is 100% out incorrect. So, let's see, U.S. sanctions. That's another mention. They have targeted apparently the Russian company. It's Gazprom. That's the Russian oil gas company subsidiary that was working on the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That has been targeted with sanctions. I'm trying to get some clarity before I, say for sure what is happening with the energy sanctions. There's reports that there's some kind of waiver. Maybe that has changed a little bit over the past 24 hours, though. And then SWIFT sanctions have been targeted to some extent, but I'm still trying to figure out if it's more general or limited to select Russian banks. So I think that's what I have on all of like the updates, all my thoughts and everything. In like, what's actually been happening in Ukraine. Now, bigger picture issue, of course, is conflict between the U.S. and Russia. This morning, horrifying news, we had announced that Russia is putting some of its nuclear deterrent weapons, they call them deterrent weapons, on a higher alert. Not sure what this is going to be matched by NATO. But it does seem like this is a very tense situation. And looking back on it, I do think we're, going to potentially talk about this, period, what we're looking, maybe the past 3 months, maybe even the past year, and who knows how much time going forward, as being one of the peaks of the new Cold War, in that there was a real possibility that, presidents pit different options and we ended the world in a nuclear conflict. Now, so far in history, everybody's made the right decision when it comes to nuclear weapons. Not, every time, but at least in the matter of their use, minus Truman. And so hopefully, again, we'll be able to get through this. But this is going to be, I think, a very tense and dangerous time that we're coming up on when we're talking about NATO and Russia starting to elevate the readiness of their nuclear forces. Now, on Ukraine in general, I did want to mention, and I think this is important, that this is a war that Russia is waging, no doubt about it. While Russia's actions here are a predictable response to the American aggression and the American NATO expansion, Ukraine is getting unduly, targeted here by Russia, and that's wrong. I'm opposed to war. What Putin is doing is wrong, and all of that. And I don't think you could really yet describe this from Russia's position as a defensive war. However, if you are in Russia, I could definitely see a lot of people in Russia looking at the landscape in Ukraine prior to this past weekend, saying that if we don't do something now, we're never going to be able to. The Americans will have so much weaponry and support for the Ukrainians that even if they never become a NATO member state like the Americans promise, they will just build up more and more weapons in Ukraine, and they will increasingly point them at Russia. It's a real problem. It's a real issue, right? This isn't nothing. And so America has a lot of responsibility in all of this, particularly over the past few months, where the Biden administration now claims that they were right, that they knew a Russian invasion was coming. And rather than trying to really focus on a solution, they kept telling Ukraine they were going to defend its territorial integrity, which they clearly were unwilling to do, because Russia has now violated that territorial integrity everywhere, every direction almost. And they're not doing anything about it. So, all important. Another thing I would like to mention is that, we have to have some context and perspective here, right? I'm not downplaying this military intervention or anything like that, but there is a difference between, say, Somalia and Iraq War II, right? Like, in the level of intensity that the U.S. was bombing, there's a difference. And Russia hasn't carried out, as to this point, a massive, air raid campaign all over Ukraine. It's unclear at this point how many people have died. The number is likely, I think, from what I've seen, in the thousands, certainly in the hundreds. But this is a bad week in Yemen, right? Let's the larger context, the nuclear weapons are important and everything like that. but there is some really nasty rhetoric going on between Western commentators and the Western press when they are trying to explain why this war has gained so much more attention than, say, another one. Why this is worse than Iraq when it's not. And the answer is simply, at the bottom of it is racism. And so, we've seen this with some commentators saying that, this is a civilized society being attacked, that, this is somehow worse because it's Europeans attacking each other. The BBC had somebody on commenting that this was bad because it was blonde-haired, blue-eyed people killing each other. This is some nasty stuff that we're talking about here, that's driving a lot of this rhetoric. And I don't want to, downplay the suffering of the Ukrainian people. I saw some nightmare story, right? Some lady, I don't know, she was a single mom, or if her husband went off to fight, she's got like a, teenage autistic son and an elderly mother that can't walk down the stairs. Like, that lady's in real trouble, and her life is going to be maybe over. Maybe she's gonna lose her mom, her kid, or something she is going to be tragic and traumatic for an extended period of time because of Putin's war. And all these things are incredibly important. And just like any war I'm talking about, I always say that, like what the American airstrikes, what the fact that even if Putin isn't carrying out a massive air war, the fact that, the air raid sirens have been going off time and time again in Kiev, and all of these poor children are suffering through that, right? It's important. But also, some context and perspective, I think, is also important here as well. And as to this point, this war has been almost nowhere as brutal as any of the other American wars that have been waged in the Middle East, from Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, particularly in the Trump years, his bombing campaign, and then Libya, another great one to add to that list. And so, not that I couldn't get to that point, but just the rhetoric in the conversation about what a crime that this is somewhat infuriating, because it no doubt is a crime. But, there's American presidents that have committed far greater crimes than this, and none of them get compared in the mainstream media to Hitler, and that's just a common comparison right now to Putin. I mean, how deep that this has bled culturally, it is absolutely insane. I was talking about this last week, how I felt that this was the first thing since COVID that had bled, a news story that had bled all the way into the celebrity pages, that Cardi B was being called out for having wrongthink on NATO or something. I don't pay that much attention. But now it's everywhere. Everybody is taking up, the cause of Ukraine and saying that they support Ukraine and oppose the Russian war, and definitely oppose the Russian war, 100% on board with that part. But at the same time, none of these people have said anything about any of the other wars for 20 years. Like some of these wars, Syria has been going on for a decade. Yemen, we're coming up, on 7 years, 8 years where we're talking about there. Somalia, decades. Iraq, decades. Libya, a decade. And they've said nothing the entire time. And so to act like this is some kind of uniquely horrific thing that's happening in the world, it's not really that uniquely horrific compared to, what's been going on in Palestine, Yemen, Somalia the past couple of months even. And so, again, we could condemn it and everything like that because it is awful. But at the same time, let's not put such a greater weight on the value of these lives just because, everybody here is in a European country. Like, the people of Yemen matter just as much. And so I think that's pretty important. So, that's where I'll wrap up. Keep putting out shows, and this nuclear issue, I think, is going to be very important. All right. Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. I'll be back with more shows later in the week.